Hi, BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. We could have given today's episode an alternative title. We didn't because it would have been far too long and also confusing to anyone reading the thumbnail. This section of chapter 23 that we're going to cover today focuses in detail on the character of two men, Fred Vincy, whom we already know a little bit, and also Mary Garth's father Caleb, whom we're meeting for the very first time. You could say that Eliot's narrator is profiling both of these characters in her text. And when I was done reading, I asked myself the question, and this is what I thought might have made a funny alternative title. Would I buy a used car from either of these men? You can see how that would have made a completely confusing title. People would have been scratching their heads thinking there were no cars in Middlemarch time, used, new, neither, right? And that's true. But both Caleb and Fred, there's enough detail in these few pages that I think any person could make a decision about whether they would buy anything from either of them, whether they would hire either of them for a job, or whether they would consider starting up a new business and going into partnership with either of them. But before we get into that, I owe you guys far more information about the epigraph at the beginning of the chapter than I gave you in the last episode. Let's just revisit that epigraph. "Your horses of the sun," he said, "and first-rate whip, Apollo. Whate'er they be, I'll eat my head, but I will beat them hollow." We already talked last episode about how this was a discussion about horsemanship, a person who was far too confident in themselves and also not having much consideration for the horses, even though they were clearly very valuable animals. So we discussed that, and I don't know how I overlooked this, but it's quite clear that this little verse that Eliot has created is making reference to classical Greek mythology, to the story of Phaeton, the son of Apollo. Now, Phaeton had a human mother, and Apollo was his father, or so his mother told him, because throughout all his growing up, he never got to see his father. And I know this is often the case with Greek gods, don't they? They father children all over the place, and I guess it's tough to be a real father to all those kids. Phaeton grew up very conscious of the fact that his father never visited him, to a point that must have made him feel insecure. If you have a copy of Stephen Fry's Mythos, by any chance, which is his lovely contemporary retelling of the Greek classical myths, he does a beautiful job of telling the story of Phaeton. I would have loved to read you from my copy of Mythos, but the extract would have been way too long, and I'm pretty sure for copyright purposes probably, would have got me in trouble. So I'm not going to do that. But I think Fred Vincy and Phaeton have a lot in common. They're both feeling inadequate as they are, and they have high aspirations for themselves, and they both make very poor judgments. They're very poor judges of their own strengths and weaknesses. Oh, and especially they are poor judges of their knowledge of horses and how to handle them. But let me do my version of a retelling. I've got some notes down here, so if I seem a bit distracted by them, it's just to make sure you get the full story. So Phaeton made a long journey when he was a young man to the sun palace of Apollo in the east, and it seems he made his father feel so guilty for having neglected him that Apollo made this rash promise to give Phaeton anything he desired without actually knowing what it was that Phaeton might desire. What Phaeton asked for was to be allowed the next day to drive the sun chariot across the sky. And Apollo is horrified. Why? Because the 4 sun stallions which drive that chariot, they're so wild, they're so wayward that even Zeus himself has been unable to control them, and only Apollo, for reasons unknown, they only seem to listen to the commands of Apollo. So Apollo tried to talk his son out of the deal, of course, offered all manner of other enticements, wealth, and all kinds of other things a young man might desire and find acceptable substitutes. But Phaeton was a stubborn guy, and he wouldn't change his mind. So the next day, Phaeton was permitted to step up into the car of the sun chariot, take the reins of the stallions into his hands. Off goes the chariot, And to begin with, everything's not too bad. And maybe that's the problem. Everything goes really smoothly. The horses, after all, know their way. They've done this journey over and over again. Every day from the east to the west, they travel with the chariot. So Phaeton, I think at some point, after looking around at the earth below him and marveling that here he is in the sun chariot, he gets a little bored. And so he thinks maybe I should be trying to steer the animals a little bit. And so the result, here we go. His first attempt to touch at the reins sends the horses plunging down, taking the chariot with them. And Phaeton is terrified. He thinks, I'm going to die. They're going to crash into the earth and I'm going to die in a blaze of glory. It doesn't quite happen like that. Phaeton tries very hard to correct whatever incorrect command he gave by pulling on the reins. And at the very last minute, the horses move upward again, take the chariot away from the earth. However, they came so close for so long that it was enough to scorch a huge piece of North Africa, that part that we now call the Sahara Desert. So you can see what the myth is trying to explain climactically. Okay, next thing that happens, right? The horses are heading up, but they don't stop heading up. They don't get back into their regular path. They carry on going up and up and up, taking the sun further and further away from the earth. Can you guess what happens now? Yes, there's an unseasonable freeze and crops die in the fields. And it's so catastrophic that Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, goes up to Mount Olympus, presents herself to Zeus and says, you have to do something. You have to do something. People are starving down here. They planted their crops. They're almost ready for harvest. And we've got a frost that's killed everything. You've got to stop this. So Zeus glances up, can see the problem, and in the way, I suppose, of all high executives, you can just make a decision so easily. He reaches out, sends a thunderbolt in the direction of Phaeton and the sun chariot, and it strikes Phaeton down. The stallions continue on. Of course, they know what they're doing, so they get back into their path and they finish the journey to the end of the day. Apollo finds out in the end exactly what has happened throughout the course of this horrible, horrible day. And he feels so bad about it that he decides he will not drive the sun chariot anymore. He gives over responsibility to one of his other sons, Helios, who from that point onward drives the chariot. Apollo can no longer face it. He's so devastated by the loss of his son. So now you have that knowledge of the myth if you didn't have it before. And just think about the fact of here's a young man, very ambitious, thinks highly of himself, but doesn't know when he's taking on more than he can handle. And let's use that knowledge now as we read through our section of the chapter. But before we do, I do want to just include a short quote from Stephen Fry's Mythos, short enough that it won't be a problem for copyright purposes. This is what he has to say about Phaeton, and the word Phaeton, which you might recognize, Phaeton. Stephen Fry says, the French named a very sporty, lightweight, dangerous racing carriage the Phaeton, in Phaeton's honor. It was the preferred conveyance of hot-headed young men of the late 18th and early 19th centuries who, unwittingly reenacting the myth of Phaeton in their youthful impetuosity, very often overturned their carriages to the fury of their long-suffering fathers. And now, on to the reading. Mr. Garth had a small office in the town, and to this Fred went with his request. He obtained it without much difficulty, for a large amount of painful experience had not sufficed to make Caleb Garth cautious about his own affairs or distrustful of his fellow men when they had not proved themselves untrustworthy. And he had the highest opinion of Fred, was sure the lad would turn out well. An open, affectionate fellow with a good bottom to his character. You might trust him for anything. Such was Caleb's psychological argument. He was one of those rare men who are rigid to themselves and indulgent to others. He had a certain shame about his neighbor's errors and never spoke of them willingly. Hence, he was not likely to divert his mind from the best mode of hardening timber and other ingenious devices in order to preconceive those errors. If he had to blame anyone, it was necessary for him to move all the papers within his reach, or describe various diagrams with his stick, or make calculations with the odd money in his pocket before he could begin, and he would rather do other men's work than find fault with their doing. I fear he was a bad disciplinarian. When Fred stated the circumstances of his debt, his wish to meet it without troubling his father, and the certainty that the money would be forthcoming so as to cause no one any inconvenience, Caleb pushed his spectacles upward, listened, looked into his favourite's clear young eyes, and believed him, not distinguishing confidence about the future from veracity about the past. But he felt that it was an occasion for a friendly hint as to conduct, and that before giving his signature he must give a rather strong admonition. Accordingly, he took the paper and lowered his spectacles, measured the space at his command, reached his pen and examined it, dipped it in the ink and examined it again, then pushed the paper a little way from him, lifted up his spectacles again, showed a deepened depression in the outer angle of his bushy eyebrows, which gave his face a peculiar mildness. Pardon these details for once. You would have learned to love them if you had known Caleb Garth, and said, in a comfortable tone, "It was a misfortune, eh, that breaking of the horse's knees? And then those exchanges, they don't answer when you have cute jockeys to deal with. You'll be wiser another time, my boy." Whereupon Caleb drew down his spectacles and proceeded to write his signature with the care which he always gave to that performance, for whatever he did in the way of business he did well. He contemplated the large, well-proportioned letters and final flourish, with his head a trifle on one side for an instant, then handed it to Fred, said good-bye, and returned forthwith to his absorption in a plan for Sir James Chetham's new farm buildings. Either because his interest in this work thrust the incident of the signature from his memory, or for some reason of which Caleb was more conscious, Mrs. Garth remained ignorant of the affair. Since it occurred, a change had come over Fred's sky, which altered his view of the distance, and was the reason why his Uncle Featherstone's present of money was of importance enough to make his colour come and go, first with a too definite expectation, and afterwards with a proportionate disappointment. His failure in passing his examination had made his accumulation of college debts the more unpardonable by his father, and there had been an unprecedented storm at home. Mr. Vincey had sworn that if he had anything more of that sort to put up with, Fred should turn out and get his living how he could, and he had never yet quite recovered his good-humoured tone to his son, who had especially enraged him by saying at this stage of things that he did not want to be a clergyman, and would rather not go on with that. Fred was conscious that he would have been yet more severely dealt with if his family, as well as himself, had not secretly regarded him as Mr. Featherstone's heir, that old gentleman's pride in him and apparent fondness for him serving in the stead of more exemplary conduct, just as when a youthful nobleman steals jewellery, we call the act kleptomania, speak of it with a philosophical smile, and never think of his being sent to the house of correction as if he were a ragged boy who had stolen turnips. In fact, tacit expectations of what would be done for him by Uncle Featherstone determined the angle at which most people viewed Fred Vincey in Middlemarch, and in his own consciousness what Uncle Featherstone would do for him in an emergency, or what he would do simply as an incorporated luck, formed always an immeasurable depth of aerial perspective. But that present of banknotes, once made, was measurable, and being applied to the amount of the debt, showed a deficit which had still to be filled up, either by Fred's judgment or by luck in some other shape. For that little episode of the alleged borrowing, in which he had made his father the agent in getting the Bulstrode certificate, was a new reason against going to his father for money toward meeting his actual debt. Fred was keen enough to foresee that anger would confuse distinctions, and that his denial of having borrowed expressly on the strength of his uncle's will would be taken as a falsehood. He had gone to his father and told him one vexatious affair, and he had left the other untold. In such cases, the complete revelation always produces the impression of a previous duplicity. Now Fred piqued himself on keeping clear of lies and even fibs. He often shrugged his shoulders and made a significant grimace at what he called Rosamond's fibs. It is only brothers who can associate such ideas with a lovely girl. And rather than incur the accusation of falsehood, he would even incur some trouble and self-restraint. It was under strong inward pressure of this kind that Fred had taken the wise step of depositing the £80 with his mother. It was a pity that he had not at once given them to Mr. Garth, but he meant to make the sum complete with another 60, and with a view to this, he had kept £20 in his own pocket as a sort of seed corn, which, planted by judgment and watered by luck, might yield more than threefold, a very poor rate of multiplication when the field is a young gentleman's infinite soul, with all the numerals at command. Fred was not a gambler. He had not that specific disease in which the suspension of the whole nervous energy on a chance or risk becomes as necessary as the dram to a drunkard. He had only the tendency to that diffusive form of gambling which has no alcoholic intensity, but is carried on with the healthiest child-fed blood, keeping up a joyous imaginative activity which fashions events according to desire, and having no fears about its own weather, only sees the advantage there must be to others in going aboard with it. Hopefulness has a pleasure in making a throw of any kind because the prospect of success is certain, and only a more generous pleasure in offering as many as possible a share in the stake. Fred liked play, especially billiards, as he liked hunting or riding a steeplechase, and he only liked it the better because he wanted money and hoped to win. But the £20 worth of seed corn had been planted in vain in the seductive green plot, all of it at least which had not been dispersed by the roadside, and Fred found himself close upon the term of payment with no money at command beyond the £80 which he had deposited with his mother. The broken-winded horse which he rode represented a present which had been made to him a long while ago by his uncle Featherstone. His father always allowed him to keep a horse, Mr. Vincey's own habits making him regard this as a reasonable demand, even for a son who was rather exasperating. This horse, then, was Fred's property, and in his anxiety to meet the imminent bill, he determined to sacrifice a possession without which life would certainly be worth little. He made the resolution with a sense of heroism forced on him by the dread of breaking his word to Mr. Garth, by his love for Mary and awe of her opinion. He would start for Houndsley Horse Fair, which was to be held the next morning, and simply sell his horse, bring back the money by coach. Well, the horse would hardly fetch more than £30, and there was no knowing what might happen. It would be folly to balk himself of luck beforehand. It was 100 to 1 that some good chance would fall his way. The longer he thought of it, the less possible it seemed that he should not have a good chance, and the less reasonable that he should not equip himself with the powder and shot for bringing it down. He would ride to Houndsley with Bambridge and with Horrock the vet, and without asking them anything expressly, he should virtually get the benefit of their opinion. Before he set out, Fred got the £80 from his mother. I wouldn't say there's a lot of additional notes and rabbit holes that we need to go into, but a few things. I adore the profiling of Caleb Garth in terms of how careful and deliberate he is in what he does. I don't know if you noticed, but in the text there were 15 different steps that Caleb Garth took to take the paper promissory note from Fred and put his signature on it. And I'll just show them on screen now. Here they are. So first he takes the paper, Then he lowers his spectacles. Then it says he measures the space at his command. That is, he looks at what space is there for his signature. How big is it? Then he reaches for his pen. Then he examines the pen. Then I presume he's looking to see if the nib is clean. I don't know. Anyway, having examined the pen, step 6, he dips it in the inkwell. When he brings it up dipped, he has to examine the pen again. Then he pushes the paper slightly away, and that is because he feels it's important to say something of some kind of admonition to Fred. So he lifts his spectacles. I don't know why that's necessary for the admonition. And he makes a kind of sad face, his bushy eyebrows angled down. But even the narrator says it looks mild. And they're speaking from some acquaintance. They're saying, oh, if you knew Caleb, you would love him. And I think, yes, I probably would. I think he's probably a very lovable, easy to get to like person. But that's not always what's important and helpful in business. So he says something wise. That's his 11th step. Having done that, I mean, I didn't feel very threatened by what he said, but I'll leave that to your judgment. But having said it, he lowers his spectacles again. Then he makes a very careful signing of the document. Then he sort of turns his head to one side to really study what it is he's put down on the paper. And having done that, then finally he returns the paper. Now that you've met Caleb, I don't know how Mary has grown up as well-behaved and as wise. It must be from her mother. It must be, because Caleb's a sweetheart. But I don't know, if a hard decision has to be made or hard words need to be said, I don't think I'd turn to Caleb. And Caleb uses a phrase that is out of date now, isn't used anymore. He talks about the cute jockeys when he's speaking to Fred and how they couldn't be beaten. Cute jockeys, let's pull it apart. The 1811 Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue by Francis Gross couldn't help me with either of these terms, which is unfortunate. The back of my Penguin Classics edition did say that jockeys was an antiquated term for horse traders, which I didn't know. I thought that's interesting. That should later become the word we use for those people who make their living riding racehorses. But anyway, but cute. It was interesting to look into cute, and I will include a link to the free dictionary because that gave us some interesting etymology. The word cute is derived from the word acute, A-C-U-T-E. So acute, as you know, if we were to describe someone's judgment as acute, that would mean that they were very sharp, very intelligent, and could see things and make good decisions. And that got shortened to cute. And we still use a form of cute today. If you've ever used the idiom, and you think you're so cute, don't you? What we're saying is we don't think cute in appearance-wise, because cute can mean of a lovely appearance. But when we're using cute there, you think you're so cute. What we're saying is you think you're so clever, you think you're so acute. And so we're using it in that way. And this is the sense in which Caleb Garth is, when he talks about cute jockeys, he means very clever horse traders. So obviously, Fred has tried to do dealings with horses in the past, and he's no good at it. He's been swindled out of money by men who are better at that than he is, which is interesting to note, okay? Because we know now at the end of this section that we're reading that Fred's going to go to the horse fair with his horse and try and sell it. And you think, wow, you haven't done well at this in the past, Fred. So how are you going to become suddenly much better at dealing with the horse traders than you have been? But what interested me is there was just a little mention down at the bottom of the paragraph here was that Caleb Garth was looking at documents relating to James Chetham's new farm buildings. And I thought, wait a second, new farm buildings. Are these the cottages that Dorothea designed? I mean, imagine if they are. If Sir James Chetham is building them, in spite the fact that Dorothea has gone and gotten engaged and married to another man after all the effort that Sir James Chetham, we know he put into this courtship, then maybe he has more real feeling for Dorothea than I imagined. I imagined him just thinking, I need to make a suitable marriage. There is a suitable woman. Right, let's go through the steps and acquire myself this woman there we go, we've acquired her. I just thought he would see it in a more businesslike manner, but now I'm thinking perhaps there was an undercurrent of actual feeling there. I mean, the other thought I had is that he's going ahead and building them anyway, because he figures that if he pays a compliment to Dorothea, however indirectly, it will please her sister. So maybe what we're hearing here is a hint that Sir James Chetham is now courting Celia, and one of the things he thinks might please her is if he shows her that he's building these cottages that her sister was so excited about. Now, it's unfortunate. If he knew what Celia's real feelings were about Dorothea and all her schemes and notions, then he might not be so quick or enthusiastic about building them. But I'm just thinking back to, remember how Sir James Chetham, he tried to offer Dorothea a chestnut horse, something better than the horse he saw her riding. And when that didn't work, when she just told him she wasn't going to keep riding anymore, he brought her this little Maltese puppy, this beautiful thing, and she refused both of these. Now, both of these, I'm certain Celia might have taken a different shine to. But it'd be so interesting if he turns to Celia and thinks I should court her differently than I courted Dorothea, because it didn't work when I tried horses and puppies. Whereas I think Celia might well have liked a little puppy. There you go. If he's just trying to impress her by building the cottages, oh well, maybe she'll be gracious and accept it in the spirit that it was given. And at the bottom of page 233, we learn something more about what's gone on with Fred Vincy and his time at the university. So he's accumulated debts. He's not passed his college exams. He's accumulated debts that had to be paid for his college expenses as well. And that whole thing together has finally, it sort of snapped. His father's otherwise easygoing temperament has finally flipped over, and apparently there was a big blow up. Maybe this is when Mrs. Vincy cried because she didn't like such unpleasantness. But Fred, he must just burn money, this boy. And it made me sad to read that passage, and his father actually being so exasperated that he's ready to threaten to just turn Fred out of doors and go, fine, make your own living how you can, not helping you at all. And I thought, wow, okay, that's pretty severe. And of course, Fred saying that he didn't want to be a clergyman. It's like, and I think the text even says, at this late point, suddenly Fred announces to everyone he doesn't really fancy being a clergyman. Fine, we've just paid for a university education for you deliberately so that you become a clergyman, and now you reveal that this is not really where you want to go. I could understand his father just losing it completely. And there being an incredible scene at home. And then the text goes on to say that the only reason the family have really tolerated Fred's crazy behavior with money is because they all expect that he's going to be Mr. Featherstone's heir. So they kind of indulge him as if he wasn't just plain old Fred Vincy, a merchant's son, but if he was Fred Vincy, who was about to inherit a lot of land and therefore become a gentleman. And I thought this was interesting because then Eliot launches into this tiny bit of an examination of English social and cultural systems. She remarks, of course, that if we find that a rich young nobleman has stolen jewelry, we don't regard it as theft in the same way we regard a poor ragged boy stealing a turnip. For the crime of stealing bread and turnips, children as young as 6 or 7 were sent to Australia at this time, just shoved on a boat. Never mind where your family are. Never mind that you don't know where you're going and whether you'll live when you get there. They would be transported to Australia for these crimes. Not so a young nobleman who stole jewelry which was worth a heck of a lot more. They would, of course, not be incarcerated. Something else would be done. Either the debt would be paid for by some other means, but they would never have to endure time in jail or debtor's prison. They would not have to do any of these. Their family would rescue them. And so the crime was looked at differently, as even though they're both theft. And if anything, the jewelry is theft of far more valuable stuff. But I also got to thinking, when we talk about noblemen who don't work and nevertheless appear to be clergymen, I mean, think of Mr. Casaubon. I mean, Fred Vincy maybe should reconsider clergyman if he knew Mr. Casaubon, because frankly, Mr. Casaubon's a perfect example of a comfortably off man who has nothing to do except what pleases him. Fred, if he could get a living, just like Mr. Casaubon, he could get his rector to do all the boring stuff, because that's what Mr. Casaubon's doing. I mean, who's giving sermons on the Sundays that Mr. Casaubon is in Rome on his honeymoon? His rector is, or possibly another parish vicar is covering that for him. And so most readers of Middlemarch, though, we don't think of Mr. Casaubon being the same as Fred Vincy. But in a way he is. He's idle. Yes, he's working on this book, but there isn't even the beginnings of a manuscript for this book. There's just volumes and volumes and volumes of research notes. And that's all he's got to show for himself after years. He's done nothing else. I don't really see, it's only this strange social skewing of how we look at idleness that makes us see Fred Vincy differently from Mr. Casaubon. Mr. Casaubon, is okay for him to be idle, apparently, because he has land and money, and so he can do what he wants. If he's idle and useless, well, that doesn't matter as much as if Fred Vincy is idle and useless when he has no land or money at present. And I want to take Fred Vincy to task, though, having said, okay, Mr. Casaubon's as bad as you are. Nevertheless, I'd like to take Fred to task. When Fred says of himself, or the narrator says about Fred piqued himself on keeping clear of lies, meaning he prided himself. This was a point of principle for him, that he would keep clear of lies. Does that mean he actually prided himself on not lying? Do you know, it just makes it sound as though a lie is something like a pothole in a road. It's something that a careless person would accidentally drive over, but someone who just, took a little bit more care would drive around. So you could avoid lying just by the way you steer your way through life. But wait a minute, no. A lie is a decision. It's not something external to you that you can just accidentally run into. A lie is a decision. And it's odd that the narrator says Fred prides himself on keeping clear of lies, as if these lies had nothing to do with him or his decision-making or how he went about things. It suggests that we already know Fred's judgment, it's open to a lot of questions, but it certainly, this little passage here suggests that Fred doesn't correctly judge his decisions for what they are. If he only told his father about the accusation made against him, that he'd claimed to be Mr. Featherstone's heir and claimed that he would be able to pay his debts from forthcoming wealth, but he didn't tell his father that he was, in fact, in debt and did not have the money to repay, then you could argue, I could see Fred saying, oh, well, that's not a lie, because I didn't actually say anything untrue to my father. That would only be upholding the letter of the law and not the spirit. Fred is withholding information from his father in order to avoid the consequences of being totally honest. I don't know how you can say that's not lying. I think only if you're being utterly technical can you say, oh, that's not a lie. So we find Fred in dire straits. What's he going to do? He's got £80 with his mother. He had 20, which was part of the £100 Mr. Featherstone gave him. The text clearly indicates that he tried to win more from that money by gambling with it. And of course, he lost it all. He lost it all because you can't see someone who's not very good at making judgments being very good at gambling. I'm sure there must be. I don't gamble myself, unless you count my lottery ticket. I suppose that's as far as I go, right? And I don't always buy those. So when I do, I guess that's a gamble, but there's really no decision making in that. But I think in something like billiards or cards or betting on horses, some judgment must come into those forms of gambling. I cannot speak from experience, but I gather just from looking at, I've seen racing form sheets, and I think, well, when you play billiards, it's your body and your skill level that you're betting against, so you must know what that is. So I just think Fred's just thrown away money again, trying to make money at something else he isn't actually any good at. And what's he finally got to do? Well, he's got a horse. Mr. Featherstone gave it to him. The horse is broken-winded, and people who own horses probably know what this means already. But for those of us who do not, and are thinking, what is a broken-winded horse exactly? Well, it's a horse that is suffering from equine asthma. That's what we would say today. And this is a condition that can develop slowly in animals, especially ones that are kept indoors in barns or stables a great deal of time, so that they're exposed in those enclosed spaces to dust and mold that gets into the bedding and the woodwork of the stables. It can't be cured, but it can be treated now with medication and changing the bedding into some substance that has lower levels of dust. I think there's something like steamed straw. I didn't realize this. There'll be a link on my website to a lovely equine place that will tell you all about the disease and what you can think about to make things better. What Elliot's narrator doesn't say is how and when this horse acquired its asthma. Was it before Fred acquired it, or since? Has it developed a problem and maybe Fred hasn't taken care to change the bedding frequently enough, or to make sure the horse gets out in the fresh air enough? Does he not ride it now that it began to have a problem with its wind? Because equine asthma means the horse will tire more, will have less endurance, because getting oxygen into the body, which it needs for movement, will become more difficult. And I also understand from this same website that a horse that has a broken wind or equine asthma will develop a mark along its flanks. Why? Because when it's exercising, it has to take more frequent breaths. And this tends to show up on its flanks as a mark on the coat. And so I would think someone with a really good eye for horses, like Marion Evans, or the horse traders at the fair that Fred is going to visit, I would think they could spot this horse's symptoms, the signs of this horse's symptoms. And so I don't know. Fred's very optimistic. He's going off to the fair to sell this horse, which he knows isn't going to make him much money, but he somehow thinks he'll have some other source of luck. He doesn't specify. It gets very woolly language down at the bottom of page 235 about how he thinks this luck is going to work, and so he needs more money with him so he can take advantage of whatever this luck is that he thinks is going to come his way. And so what does he do? As we finish on the top of page 236, and I had to finish there, he borrows that darn £80 back from his mother. And you just know, don't you? You know, I ended there because my heart sank. Fred's going to get in a mess. You just know it is. And just so you know, that £100 that Mr. Featherstone gave Fred is the equivalent to £14,500 today, or in US dollars, 19,400. There you go. No small amount of money. And Fred's already managed to blow 20 pounds of it. So that's a fifth of that $19,400. It really is right now like watching young Phaeton step up into Apollo's sun chariot, take the reins in his hands, and you think, oh, wow, here we go. But I've got to get another Middlemarch meditation ready for next week. So like it or not, I'm going to find out just how bad things get. And I guess you are too. Thanks very much for joining me today, guys. And as I say, in a week's time, you will get another Middlemarch meditation. Between that, you will get a non-fiction review. I finally finished my review of Elaine Castillo's How to Read Now, a fantastic book, a really important book, I believe, and you will get the sense of that when you watch that review. So look forward to seeing you then in a few days' time. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.